September 19th, 1941, the outskirts of Kiev. The sky hung low, veiled in smoke and dust. The once grand city of Kiev lay silent, its streets littered with wrecked trucks, twisted rifles, and the still bodies of men who'd fought until the last bullet. Columns of Soviet prisoners stretched beyond the horizon, tens of thousands, stumbling through fields, their faces hollow with exhaustion. To the German soldiers watching them pass, it looked like the war was already won. Officers smiled, cigarettes in hand, standing atop captured Soviet tanks. A radio crackled with the words, "Ein großer Sieg," a great victory. In Berlin, Hitler's headquarters erupted in celebration. Reports called it the greatest encirclement in history. Over 600,000 Soviet troops captured. The Führer proclaimed the Red Army finished, the Soviet Union broken. But beneath the cheers, the truth was taking shape. Each day lost in Ukraine would bring winter closer to Moscow. Each triumph would pull the German army farther from safety. And this dazzling triumph at Kiev, would become the victory that destroyed their future. June 22nd, 1941. At dawn, across 1,000 kilometers of frontier, the silence shattered. 3 million German and Axis soldiers surged across the Soviet border, the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Columns of panzers roared through the morning mist. Stukas screamed overhead, diving on Soviet airfields. Artillery thundered across rivers and wheat fields, and within hours, the front had dissolved into chaos. Hitler called it a crusade, a war of annihilation against Bolshevism. In Berlin, propaganda reels showed confident troops waving from armored vehicles, the black crosses on their tanks glinting in the sunlight. To the German people, it seemed unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had divided into 3 colossal formations. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal von Lieb, driving toward Leningrad Army Group Center under Fedor von Bock, racing toward Smolensk and Moscow, Army Group South, led by Gerd von Rundstedt, tasked with capturing Ukraine and its rich resources. In the first 6 weeks, the German blitzkrieg tore through Soviet defenses. Minsk fell. Smolensk followed. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Over 1 million prisoners taken. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was collapsing faster than France had in 1940. But as the front advanced, distances grew. Supply lines stretched thin. Roads turned to dust in the summer heat. Trucks broke down, horses collapsed, and fuel convoys lagged behind. The speed that once defined blitzkrieg began to falter. Yet Moscow still beckoned, the heart of Soviet command, the symbol of victory. If it fell, many believed the war in the East would end. Every German general knew this. Guderian, Halder, and Bock pressed the same argument. Drive for Moscow now, before the enemy recovers. But Hitler's attention shifted south. Reports from Army Group South told of vast Soviet forces massing near Kiev and the Dnieper River. Intelligence estimated over 500,000 men in the region, a potential threat to the German flank. Hitler saw an opportunity to destroy them all in one massive encirclement. His generals warned that turning south would delay the advance on Moscow by crucial weeks. Guderian protested fiercely, arguing that time, not territory, was Germany's greatest enemy. But Hitler was unmoved. He demanded Kiev first. The largest encirclement in history, as he called it. That single decision would reshape the war's fate. By late July 1941, the German army stood deep inside Soviet territory. Smolensk had fallen. Moscow seemed within reach, barely 400 kilometers away. Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center was bloodied but still advancing. Tanks under Generals Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth had torn open the Red Army's front, leaving Soviet command in disarray. To the generals, the path was clear. Strike straight toward Moscow. End the campaign before winter. But in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's command bunker in East Prussia, Another vision took shape. On August 21, 1941, a directive arrived. Army Group Center was ordered to halt. Instead of driving toward Moscow, Hitler commanded Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group to pivot south, to join forces with Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group advancing north from Ukraine. The goal: surround and annihilate Soviet forces defending Kiev. For the professional soldiers, it was a shock. The offensive momentum, painstakingly gained at enormous cost, was about to be diverted. Guderian argued in his journal that this turn to the south risked everything the army had achieved. He warned that the delay would allow the Soviets to regroup, fortify Moscow, and prepare reserves. But Hitler's mind was fixed on another kind of victory, one that could be seen and measured. Ukraine was rich in grain, oil, and coal. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and Hitler believed its capture would cripple Stalin's war machine. He saw Moscow as symbolic, but Kiev practical. In his eyes, destroying the Soviet armies in the south would open the road to the Caucasus and its vital oil fields. In reality, both goals could not be achieved at once. The order went out. Guderian's armored columns wheeled south through Gomel and Konotop, covering nearly 200 miles in blistering heat and choking dust. The logistical nightmare worsened. Fuel shortages, worn-out engines, and growing resistance. Yet, despite the strain, the southern thrust closed in with mechanical precision. Meanwhile, Marshal Semyon Budyonny commanded the Soviet Southwestern Front, defending Kiev. Over 600,000 men. They were trapped between the Dnieper River to the west and the advancing pincers from the north and south. Stalin, refusing to believe the threat, ordered them to hold their ground. Withdrawal was forbidden. By early September, the trap was nearly closed. The German pincers, Guderian from the north, Kleist from the south, were only 40 kilometers apart. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights confirmed the scale of the encirclement. Inside the pocket, panic spread among Soviet units, communications collapsed, and retreat turned impossible. On September 14, 1941, the two German spearheads met east of Lochwitze. The jaws of the trap shut tight. Over 600,000 Soviet troops were now encircled, the largest pocket in military history. In Berlin, Hitler proclaimed, "The Battle of Kiev is the greatest victory of all time." His generals stood silent. They knew what the maps did not show, that Moscow, the real prize, had slipped beyond reach. The tactical masterpiece, by the first week of September 1941, the vast plains of Ukraine became the stage for a deadly choreography of steel and precision. The encirclement of Kiev was not luck. It was a calculated, meticulously coordinated strike. The operation's brilliance lay in its timing and synchronization. While the main Soviet forces faced Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an unexpected threat began to descend from the north. General Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, detached from Army Group Center, sweeping down from the direction of Gomel. His armored divisions, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Divisions, among others, were veterans of France and Smolensk. They knew the rhythm of blitzkrieg: strike fast, isolate, and encircle. They bypassed strongpoints, leaving infantry to mop up, and drove deep into the Soviet rear. To the south, Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group thundered northward from Kirovograd, its tanks rolling over dusty steppe roads, engines roaring in the dry heat. Between them lay hundreds of kilometers of Soviet-held territory, filled with rivers, villages, and desperate defenders. Yet both armored thrusts advanced with clockwork accuracy, guided by Luftwaffe reconnaissance and radio intercepts. The Soviet Southwestern Front, under Marshal Semyon Budyonny and General Mikhail Kirponos, tried desperately to stabilize the line. But their communication networks were collapsing under German airstrikes. Supply columns burned on the roads. Bridges across the Desna and Dnieper were destroyed by retreating units. The Red Army still fought ferociously. Entire divisions stood and died in place, but they could no longer maneuver. Every day, the jaws of the German trap closed tighter. By September 10th, the distance between Guderian's and Kleist's spearheads had shrunk to just 60 kilometers. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, strafing Soviet convoys and isolating the battlefield. German infantry from Army Group South's 6th Army, under Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, pressed eastward to reinforce the encirclement's outer ring. On September 14th, near the town of Lochwitze, the two armored pincers met. Guderian later wrote in his memoir Panzer Leader that the moment was a sight of absolute finality, the perfect execution of the encirclement doctrine the Wehrmacht had refined since Poland and France. Within hours, the Soviet command in Kiev realized the truth. Their entire front, nearly 43 divisions, was trapped. Soviet radio messages, intercepted by the Germans, were filled with confusion and despair. Kirponos pleaded for permission to retreat, but Stalin's orders were explicit. Kiev must be held. German morale soared. Soldiers watched endless columns of prisoners streaming out of the forests. Artillery shells pounded the pocket relentlessly. The encirclement ring shrank day by day, squeezing the trapped armies into smaller and smaller zones of resistance. To the outside world, it looked like another flawless triumph of German operational genius. But beneath that brilliance, cracks were forming, exhaustion, supply shortages, and the creeping realization that this was victory at a cost they could not afford. And inside the pocket, 600,000 Soviet soldiers were about to experience one of the most brutal collapses in modern warfare. The human and strategic cost inside the tightening noose around Kiev. The landscape had become a graveyard. By mid-September 1941, over 500,000 Soviet troops were trapped between the Dnieper River to the west and the German armored walls to the east. Forests burned for days, turning the skies orange. Streams ran black with oil and mud. The air was heavy with the stench of smoke, cordite, and unburied dead. Cut off from supplies, Soviet soldiers fought with dwindling ammunition and fading hope. Units formed desperate breakout attempts, scattered, uncoordinated charges against steel and machine guns. Some divisions resorted to night assaults, slipping through fields under the light of burning villages. Most never returned. Command inside the pocket collapsed. Marshal Semyon Budyonny was removed from command, replaced too late by Semyon Timoshenko and then by General Mikhail Kirponos, who refused to abandon his men. On September 20th, as German troops closed the last escape corridors, Kirponos and his staff tried to break out. They were ambushed near Dremailovka. Kirponos was killed, still clutching his field map. His body was found days later among hundreds of fallen officers. For the Germans outside the pocket, it was a spectacle beyond imagination. Endless columns of Soviet prisoners trudged toward makeshift enclosures. Entire corps, regiments, and battalions stripped of weapons. German soldiers, hardened by months of combat, were stunned by the sheer number. Some estimates claim over 665,000 men captured, along with thousands of guns and tanks. Propaganda photographers filmed the scenes, turning the devastation into images of triumph for German audiences back home. In Hitler's headquarters, the mood was euphoric. When news of Kiev's fall reached the Wolf's Lair, Hitler declared it the greatest victory in history. His generals stood around the map table, exhausted but silent. They knew the scale was enormous, but they also knew the cost. The armored divisions that achieved it were worn out. Tanks needed repairs. Engines had run thousands of miles. The Luftwaffe's air crews were stretched thin, and ammunition stocks were dwindling. The German field armies were victorious, but they were also spent. Even worse, the crucial factor of time had vanished. The operation to encircle Kiev had consumed nearly a full month, from mid-August to mid-September. By the time the southern front was secured, autumn had arrived. The Soviet capital, Moscow, still stood, and now the infamous Rasputitsa, the Russian mud season, was only weeks away. On the maps in Berlin, it still looked like victory. But in the field, commanders like Guderian saw something else: a campaign losing momentum, divisions starving for fuel, and weather turning against them. The Germans had achieved a victory of annihilation, but in doing so, they had sacrificed the one thing no army could recover: time. And as their columns finally turned north again, toward Moscow, the seeds of their own disaster were already in the ground. The fall of Kiev, September 19, 1941. German troops entered Kiev. The ancient city, once a jewel of Eastern Europe, lay smoldering. Entire districts were flattened. The golden domes of cathedrals stood blackened with soot. Streets were filled with rubble and silent faces, civilians who had endured weeks of shelling and starvation. To the Wehrmacht, it was another triumph in their unstoppable march east. The German Sixth Army raised the swastika over government buildings as engineers began clearing mines and debris. Photographs of cheering soldiers appeared in German newspapers under bold headlines: "Kiev gefallen, the fall of Kiev." Field Marshal von Rundstedt radioed Berlin: "The enemy in the south is annihilated." For the moment, it was true. The numbers were staggering: 665,000 prisoners, 884 tanks, and 3,178 artillery pieces captured. The Soviet Southwestern Front ceased to exist. Never before in modern warfare had an army of that size been destroyed in a single encirclement. Hitler's confidence soared to new heights. He addressed his generals with triumph, declaring, "This is the greatest battle in the history of the world." He believed the Soviet Union was finished, its armies shattered, its people broken. The road to Moscow, he thought, would be nothing more than a final march to victory. But beneath the surface, the signs of exhaustion were everywhere. The panzers that closed the ring at Kiev were barely operational. Maintenance units struggled to replace engines that had been running non-stop since June. Supply trains lagged hundreds of miles behind, clogged by destroyed rail lines and partisan sabotage. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 1,000 aircraft since the start of the campaign. Even as Kiev fell, the German advance had begun to slow. Autumn rains were approaching. The once dry steppe would soon turn into deep, impassable mud. Soviet resistance, though crushed in the south, was stiffening along the central front. Reinforcements streamed toward Moscow, and the Red Army, bloodied but not broken, was learning, adapting, hardening. In Berlin, the newspapers called it Der Triumph des Jahrhunderts, the triumph of the century. But at the front, the men who fought it felt a quiet unease. The horizon ahead was gray, the air colder each day. Their victory was already beginning to die in the mud. The price of delay. When the last Soviet pockets near Kiev were crushed, the German armies turned north once again. The tanks of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group rumbled toward Orel and Bryansk, engines coughing, treads worn smooth by thousands of kilometers of campaign. It was late September. The bright, dry summer roads that had carried Blitzkrieg's fury were gone. In their place came the first rains, thin, cold, and relentless. The Rasputitsa, the dreaded Russian mud season, had arrived. Highways turned into rivers of sludge. Supply convoys sank to their axles. Trucks abandoned by the roadside were scavenged for parts. Soldiers dragged guns by hand or hitched horses to stalled vehicles. Every kilometer became a battle against terrain and exhaustion. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler ordered Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow. It was already October. The plan called for a renewed push by Army Group Center, Guderian's armor from the south, Hoth from the north, and infantry armies filling the middle. But the weeks lost at Kiev had given the Soviets the time they needed to fortify. New defensive lines stretched across the approaches to Moscow. Fresh reserves, divisions from Siberia and the Far East, were moving west. The Germans still advanced, fighting ferocious battles at Bryansk and Vyazma, creating new pockets of destruction. Tens of thousands more Soviet prisoners were taken. Yet the weather grew worse. Fuel froze overnight. Engines refused to start. Frostbite struck harder than Soviet bullets. By late November, German troops could see the distant glow of Moscow's lights. They could hear its air raid sirens at night, but their strength was gone. Ammunition was short, uniforms were thin, and winter was tightening its grip. And then, on December 5, 1941, the final blow fell. The Red Army, reinforced and commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive. Fresh Soviet troops, many wearing white camouflage and equipped for the cold, smashed into the exhausted German lines. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht broke and fell back. The advance on Moscow was over. What began as the greatest encirclement in military history had bought only one thing: time for the Soviet Union to survive. The victory at Kiev had delayed Operation Typhoon just long enough for winter and disaster to arrive. The shattering before Moscow. The winter of 1941 struck like a hammer. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees. The roads turned to ice, weapons froze in soldiers' hands, and men collapsed in the snow from exhaustion and hunger. For an army built on speed, the cold was its deadliest enemy. The Wehrmacht had reached the very gates of Moscow. Towns like Klin, Tula, and Khimki became the front line. Some German advance units could see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars, yet they could go no farther. Their engines refused to start. Their rifles jammed. Even their food froze solid in tins. Supplies never arrived. Fuel barrels cracked in the cold. Horses starved or froze where they stood. Entire battalions were reduced to half strength without a single shot fired. For the first time since the invasion began, German soldiers faced an enemy they could not outmaneuver: nature itself. Then came the Soviet counterstroke. On December 5, 1941, Marshal Zhukov unleashed fresh divisions drawn from Siberia, men accustomed to the cold, armed with new T-34 tanks and heavy artillery. They struck with ferocity across the entire front. The exhausted Wehrmacht staggered backward. Entire divisions fell into retreat. Frost-bitten soldiers abandoned vehicles and weapons as they fled through waist-deep snow. German command posts reported panic and disarray. Officers ordered, "Stand fast," but the men could no longer stand at all. By January 1942, the German army had been pushed back over 150 miles from Moscow. For the first time in the war, the Red Army had seized the initiative. In Berlin, silence replaced celebration. The same newspapers that once hailed the victory at Kiev now spoke cautiously of a temporary setback. But inside the high command, the truth was unmistakable. The offensive that had begun with the largest invasion in history had ended in retreat, frostbite, and failure. Kiev, once Hitler's greatest triumph, was now remembered only as the turning point that had doomed Barbarossa. What had been hailed as Germany's crowning victory had, in the frozen ruins outside Moscow, become the foundation of its greatest defeat. The victory that broke the Wehrmacht in the years that followed. Many German officers would look back on 1941 as the moment everything changed. They spoke not of the triumphs, but of the decisions, the fatal misjudgments buried beneath the surface of success. Field Marshal Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, later wrote in his war diaries, "The Kiev victory was dazzling, but it cost us Moscow." What had seemed like a strategic masterpiece, the encirclement of over 600,000 Soviet troops, had in reality fractured Germany's campaign plan. Every tank diverted south toward Kiev was a tank not racing toward Moscow. Every week spent capturing Ukraine was a week lost before the winter set in. When the snows came and the Red Army counterattacked, the balance of the war shifted irreversibly. The Wehrmacht would never again come so close to victory in the east. Hitler, intoxicated by success, refused to admit error. He dismissed generals who warned of the coming catastrophe. Guderian, who had once driven his tanks across half of Europe, was relieved of command. Others fell silent, realizing that questioning the Führer's strategy meant exile, or worse. But the truth could not be silenced forever. As historians later examined the campaign, they came to see Kiev as the pivot point, the moment when the blitzkrieg ideal met the reality of a war too vast to win. Germany's resources were stretched, its supply lines strangled by distance, and its leadership blinded by arrogance. By choosing glory over prudence, Hitler had condemned his army to fight a war it could no longer control. In the smoking ruins outside Moscow, the myth of invincibility was shattered. From that winter onward, Germany would never again dictate the pace of the Eastern Front. The victory at Kiev, the greatest encirclement in military history, had done more than destroy a Soviet army. It had destroyed Germany's chance to win the war. The price of perfection. The fields around Kiev are quiet now. The earth that once shook beneath German panzers and Soviet artillery lies still, covered in grass and memory. Beneath it rest tens of thousands who fought for an empire that no longer exists, and for a victory that led only to ruin. History often remembers wars through their victories, but the Battle of Kiev reminds us that not all victories are blessings. Some are illusions, bright flares that burn too fast, too bright, before plunging everything into darkness. For the Wehrmacht, Kiev was that flare, a moment when tactical brilliance eclipsed strategic reason, when ambition outran wisdom. The destruction of the Soviet Southwestern Front had convinced Hitler that his instincts were infallible, that he understood war better than his generals. But in truth, every success at Kiev chained Germany tighter to a war it could not sustain. The soldiers who marched east afterward, toward Moscow, toward Stalingrad, toward the endless snows, carried with them the shadow of that decision. The victory at Kiev had expanded the map, but it had also expanded the graves. In the end, the battle's legacy was not measured in territory gained, but in the limits it exposed of men, machines, and ideology. The Wehrmacht could win battles, but it could not win forever. When the Red Army returned to Ukraine in 1943, it was not to reclaim what was lost. It was to end what had begun. The cycle had closed. Kiev had been both the peak and the precipice, the victory that proved Germany's power, and revealed its fatal weakness. Because in war, as history forever whispers, the most dangerous victory is the one that makes you believe you cannot lose.